A lively group of tourists had gathered around one of the city's most iconic landmarks. They marveled at the impressive building in front of them, eagerly snapping pictures and chatting about the royal history. Among the crowd stood Karen, a middle-aged woman who was loudly complaining about everything in sight. She wore large, dark sunglasses that didn't quite hide her haughty attitude. Karen had already had a few drinks at the pub before arriving at the landmark, and the alcohol had certainly loosened her tongue. She began to make rude comments about the royal guards standing still beside their magnificent horses. "Look at them," Karen said loudly, pointing at the guards. "They're just standing there like statues. How boring. What a waste of time. They should be doing something useful." Her voice was slurred from the drinks, but that didn't stop her from continuing to complain. Her friends, trying to avoid trouble, exchanged nervous glances and gently urged her to keep her voice down. But Karen wasn't listening. "Oh, come on," she muttered. "What kind of job is this? Pretending to stand still all day. I could do that in my sleep. Who needs all that fancy uniform nonsense?" Karen continued to talk loudly, completely oblivious to the growing discomfort of the people around her. As she staggered forward, she spotted one of the royal guard's horses. It was a majestic black stallion, its coat shining in the sun. Karen's eyes lit up, and she grinned. "Now that's something I want to get close to," she said. She stumbled toward the horse, slurring her words even more as she approached. The horse flicked its ears at her, but otherwise stood perfectly still. Karen didn't seem to understand that the horse was a part of the royal guard's duties and that it wasn't to be treated like a pet. She grinned, reaching out her hand toward the horse's reins, clearly intending to touch them. The horse, however, was trained to remain calm in stressful situations, and it didn't move. But the royal guard did. Though his expression didn't change, his eyes briefly flicked to Karen's hand as she reached for the reins. He gave the slightest tug on the horse's lead, causing the horse to take a small step back. Karen didn't notice the subtle movement, too busy laughing at what she thought was a harmless joke. "Hey, look at this," Karen called to her friends. "The horse is scared of me. Look at that little jump. Maybe I'll give it a good pet to calm it down." She wobbled closer, completely ignoring the fact that the horse was a royal symbol and not a pet to be handled by anyone, especially a stranger. The crowd around her began to murmur, some quietly warning Karen to stay away, while others exchanged uncomfortable looks. Karen's friends tried to pull her back, but Karen wasn't having it. "Oh please, it's just a horse. What's the big deal?" she slurred as she swayed closer. The royal guard didn't flinch, though the tension in his body was palpable. He had seen tourists act inappropriately before, but there was something about Karen's behavior that crossed the line. She wasn't just being disrespectful to the traditions of the royal guard. Her actions were rude and borderline dangerous. Karen reached forward and, with an almost comical lack of awareness, grabbed the horse's reins. The horse shifted again, this time more noticeably, letting out a quiet snort of discomfort. Karen giggled as if the whole situation was just a funny game. The guard took a deep breath, his training kicking in. He had been prepared for situations like this, and he was well aware of how to maintain control. He slowly moved forward, stepping directly in front of Karen and blocking her from getting any closer to the horse. His presence was imposing, and Karen, for the first time, stopped in her tracks. "What's wrong with you?" Karen demanded, her voice slurring. "Why don't you do your job and let me pet the horse?" She waved her hand in the air, dismissing the guard. "You're just a statue, aren't you? Nothing more than a soldier in a fancy uniform." The guard stood firm, silent but unyielding. His expression remained as stoic as ever, but his eyes were sharp, clearly telling Karen that she had pushed him too far. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, with some tourists starting to take out their phones to capture the scene. Karen, now growing more frustrated, began to shout, "Do something. You can't just stand there. I'm not scared of you." Her voice was getting louder and more angry, her behavior becoming more erratic. But the guard didn't move a muscle. He simply continued to block her from the horse. keeping his calm demeanor despite her outbursts. The situation had clearly reached a boiling point, and Karen's overconfidence in her ability to do whatever she wanted was about to face the consequences. The crowd waited, wondering what would happen next. Karen's behavior was getting out of hand. The crowd around her was starting to tense up, unsure of what would happen next. She had no idea that her actions were about to take a serious turn. Her friends, who had been trying to stay out of the situation, now stepped in, urging her to stop before things got worse. "Karen, come on, let's just leave it alone," one of them said. "This isn't funny anymore." But Karen wasn't listening. Her confidence was growing as she saw the crowd's attention shift toward her. "What are you all staring at?" she shouted, her voice a mix of anger and drunken bravado. "I'm just trying to have some fun with this horse. You people are so uptight." She turned back toward the royal guard, her eyes narrowing as she made a plan in her mind. "That's it," Karen muttered to herself, swaying slightly as she took another step closer to the horse. "I'll show them all that I'm not scared of anything." With a smug grin, she reached out again, this time attempting to grab hold of the reins with both hands. But the royal guard wasn't having it. With swift precision, he moved his body slightly, enough to prevent Karen from getting too close to the horse. His presence was imposing, and Karen's bravado faltered for just a second. Still, she was determined. "Why won't you let me near it?" she demanded. "I just want to take a picture." "Is that so wrong?" The guard didn't respond. His silence spoke louder than words. But as Karen took another step forward, he finally spoke, his voice firm and calm. "You are violating the rules," he said. "This is not a petting zoo. Please step away from the horse." His voice didn't rise in anger, but the authority behind his words was undeniable. Karen, however, wasn't used to being told what to do. "Rules? What rules? I'm a paying tourist. This is a free country," she shouted, her voice growing louder and more shrill. Her eyes were wide, her face flushed from both the alcohol and the frustration of being stopped. "You can't stop me. I'm here for vacation, and I'll do whatever I want." The crowd around her seemed to shift uneasily, some muttering among themselves, while others were clearly uncomfortable with the way Karen was acting. Several people had now taken out their phones to capture what was becoming a dramatic scene. The royal guard, standing tall and unfazed, remained calm, his eyes never leaving Karen's. As Karen grew more agitated, her friends tried once again to pull her away. "Please, Karen, just walk away," one of them begged. "This is getting out of hand." But Karen was too far gone. The alcohol had clouded her judgment, and her stubbornness had taken over. "I'm not going anywhere," she snapped, pushing her friends away. She moved even closer to the horse, ignoring the guard's warning. That was when the royal guard made his next move. His expression remained as serious as ever, but his actions spoke volumes. He subtly shifted his position, positioning himself between Karen and the horse. His posture was imposing, and his presence alone made it clear that there would be no more chances. Karen, realizing she had been blocked, looked up at him in disbelief. "Are you seriously going to stand there and stop me?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You can't tell me what to do. I'm American. We don't follow your ridiculous rules." The guard didn't flinch, and for a moment, it seemed like time stood still. The crowd, who had been watching in tense silence, now held their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Karen's bravado was slipping, and she was starting to realize that she wasn't in control of the situation anymore. Still, she wasn't backing down. "I demand to speak to someone in charge," she shouted. "This is ridiculous." Her voice cracked with frustration as she tried once again to get past the guard, but he was unwavering. The royal guard was trained for moments like this, where patience was key. He didn't need to raise his voice or lose his temper. With a subtle motion, he raised his hand, signaling for backup. Almost immediately, another guard appeared, followed by a stern-looking official wearing a uniform. The official had a clipboard in his hand and a no-nonsense attitude. Karen froze, her mouth open in shock. She hadn't expected this level of authority to arrive so quickly. The official exchanged a quick glance with the first guard, and without saying a word, the guard stepped aside, allowing the official to take over the situation. "Ma'am," the official said, his voice calm but firm. "You have broken several rules regarding conduct around royal guards and their horses. I must ask you to leave the area immediately." Karen stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What? Are you serious? I didn't do anything wrong," she protested, her voice rising in anger. "I just wanted to touch the horse." The official shook his head. "It's not about the horse," he replied. "It's about respect for the traditions and rules that govern this place. You've already been warned. Now, you must leave." Karen's friends, now looking embarrassed and uncomfortable, quietly tried to pull her away. But Karen was still in denial. "This is outrageous," she yelled, shaking free from their grip. "You can't kick me out for this. I'm just having some fun." But the official wasn't backing down. "You were warned, and now you'll be escorted out. Failure to comply will result in further action." Karen looked around, realizing that she was no longer the center of attention. Instead, the crowd was watching, some recording the entire ordeal. It was clear that she had crossed a line, and now the consequences were about to unfold. Karen's frustration continued to rise as the official's words sank in. She was no longer in control of the situation. The crowd that had once watched her in amusement now seemed to turn against her. Phones were still recording, and some people whispered to each other, shaking their heads at her behavior. Karen's face turned a shade of red, both from embarrassment and anger. She wasn't used to being told no, especially not by someone she didn't respect. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath, stomping her foot like a child having a tantrum. "I'm a paying tourist. I came here to have fun, and now you're kicking me out for nothing." Her voice wavered between outrage and disbelief as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The official didn't flinch. He stood there, calm and composed, with his clipboard in hand. Behind him, the two royal guards stood like statues, their presence still looming large. The official's tone didn't change. "You've already ignored our requests, and now I'm asking you to leave. If you don't comply, I'll have to take further steps." Karen's friends, who had been standing at the back of the crowd, exchanged nervous glances. They had no idea how the situation had escalated so quickly. "Karen, just stop," one of them pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't worth it." But Karen wasn't listening. She was too far gone now. The alcohol had clouded her judgment, and her refusal to back down had made her stubborn. "I'm not leaving," she said defiantly, crossing her arms over her chest. "You can't make me. I'm an American. You don't have the right to treat me like this." The crowd was silent now. They could feel the tension in the air. Some people were still recording, but many were watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The official gave a small sigh and glanced at one of the royal guards. The guard gave a slight nod, and with that, the official took a step closer to Karen. "Ma'am, I'm giving you one last chance," the official said, his voice stern but calm. "If you do not leave this area voluntarily, we will have no choice but to escort you out." Karen stood there, staring at the official, her mind racing. She was struggling to maintain her bravado, but deep down, she could feel the weight of the situation. She was starting to realize that she had pushed things too far. Still, she refused to back down. "I'm not going anywhere," she shouted, trying to keep her voice steady. "You can't tell me what to do. I'm a guest here. I have rights." The official raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. He turned slightly, signaling to the two guards. Without warning, one of them stepped forward, his uniform pristine and his expression unreadable. "Ma'am, I must insist," the guard said, his tone unwavering. "It's time for you to leave." Karen's heart raced as the guard moved toward her. She could feel the crowd's eyes on her, the weight of their judgment growing heavier with every passing second. She hadn't expected the situation to escalate like this. The reality of the consequences was starting to hit her, but her pride refused to let her admit defeat. "No," she said again, her voice cracking this time. "I'm not going anywhere. You can't make me." The guard didn't react to her outburst. Instead, he simply moved forward and then gently but firmly placed a hand on her arm, signaling that she needed to leave. Karen, now realizing that she couldn't win this battle, tried to pull away, but the guard's grip was steady and unyielding. "Let go of me," she shouted, trying to shake him off. Her voice was shrill, but it only drew more attention from the crowd. Some people looked on in disbelief, while others seemed to feel pity for her. The official stepped closer, his expression serious. "You've been warned. Now, I will escort you out." Karen struggled for a few more moments, but it was clear that the situation had completely slipped out of her control. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The crowd continued to watch, some murmuring in sympathy, while others simply stared in silence at the unfolding drama. Finally, realizing that her resistance was futile, Karen stopped struggling. Her shoulders slumped, and she shot one last angry look at the royal guards and the official. "This isn't over," she muttered, but the official didn't respond. With the guard still holding her arm gently but firmly, Karen was escorted out of the area. As she walked away, the crowd began to disperse, some people shaking their heads, while others returned to their sightseeing. The once chaotic scene began to settle, but the memory of Karen's outburst lingered in the air. The royal guard returned to his post, unmoved by the disruption. His professionalism and calm had stood in stark contrast to Karen's reckless behavior. The crowd slowly went back to their day, some of them still discussing the strange and uncomfortable encounter. For Karen, it was a humbling experience. Her alcohol-fueled outburst had led her to an embarrassing and humiliating moment, and it was clear she would be leaving the landmark with a lot less dignity than when she arrived. The royal guard's calm handling of the situation had shown her just how much she had overstepped. Karen was escorted out of the area, and her friends followed closely behind, apologizing quietly to the official and guards as they left. As they walked away from the crowd, Karen's anger boiled over. She wasn't one to admit when she was wrong, and now that she was being forced to leave, she felt humiliated and furious. "Can you believe this?" Karen muttered angrily to her friends. "I'm just trying to have a little fun, and they treat me like a criminal." Her face was flushed with rage, and her steps were unsteady as she stumbled down the street, still unsteady from the alcohol. Her friends, looking embarrassed and apologetic, tried to calm her down. "Karen, you've got to let it go," one of them said quietly. "You pushed it too far. You can't just do whatever you want here. They were right to ask you to stop." But Karen wasn't hearing any of it. "Right to stop me? I was just having a laugh. And now I'm being kicked out like I'm some kind of troublemaker." She shook her head in disbelief. "It's because I'm American, isn't it? They didn't like me because I'm not from here." Her friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, but they said nothing. They knew it wasn't about where she was from, but Karen refused to listen. Her mind was stuck on the idea that she had been treated unfairly. And the more she thought about it, the angrier she became. As they reached the corner of the street, a small crowd was still gathered near the landmark, most of them talking quietly about what had just happened. Karen's outburst hadn't gone unnoticed, and several people who had witnessed the scene were discussing it among themselves. One tourist, a man with a thick accent, overheard Karen complaining and couldn't help but speak up. "It's not about where you're from," he said, his voice tinged with annoyance. "It's about respect. You can't just go around harassing people and animals like that." Karen whipped around to face him. "Who are you to tell me what to do?" she snapped, her words slurring slightly. "You don't know anything about me." The man raised his eyebrows, clearly unfazed by her anger. "I saw what you did. You disrespected the guard and the horse. I don't care where you're from. That's not right." The confrontation caught the attention of several people nearby, and a few of them nodded in agreement. Karen's friends took a few steps back, sensing the situation was about to escalate further. Karen, however, didn't back down. She crossed her arms defiantly and glared at the man. "You think you know everything, don't you? Well, I don't care about your opinions. I was just having some fun. And now I'm being treated like a criminal. This whole place is ridiculous." The man simply shook his head. "Maybe you should think about your actions before you blame others. They were just doing their job, and you had no respect for that." The words hit Karen harder than she expected. She opened her mouth to argue, but this time, she couldn't find the right words. The anger that had been driving her for the past hour started to fade, replaced by a sense of unease. In that moment, she realized that she had let her frustration and alcohol cloud her judgment. She had crossed a line and didn't even realize it until it was too late. Still, she wasn't ready to admit that she was in the wrong. Instead, she turned on her heel and walked away, her friends trailing behind her. "Let's just go back to the hotel," she muttered, avoiding eye contact with anyone around her. As they walked away, Karen couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The reality of what had just happened was sinking in. She had embarrassed herself in front of an entire crowd. And worse, she had made a scene that would likely be remembered by everyone who had witnessed it. The shame was starting to set in, but Karen wasn't ready to acknowledge it. Instead, she focused on the anger that was still bubbling inside her, unwilling to let go of the idea that she had been treated unfairly. When they finally reached the hotel, Karen stormed up to her room without speaking to anyone. Her friends exchanged a few words among themselves, but there was no real resolution to the situation. They knew Karen wasn't going to apologize, and they weren't sure if she would ever reflect on what had happened. The next morning, Karen woke up with a pounding headache. The effects of the alcohol from the night before were still lingering, and as she sat up in bed, the events of the previous day came rushing back. She had been kicked out of a historic site, disrespected the royal guard, and caused a scene in front of dozens of tourists. It was hard to ignore the fact that she had crossed a serious line. She stared out the window, her reflection in the glass a reminder of the embarrassing incident. The anger had faded, replaced by a deep sense of regret. For the first time, Karen wondered if her actions had gone too far. Had she really been treated unfairly, or had she simply misjudged the entire situation? Still, Karen wasn't ready to admit it. It was easier to blame others, to tell herself that it wasn't her fault. But deep down, she knew that the humiliation of the previous day wasn't something she could easily shake off. The royal guard's calm handling of the situation had exposed her for what she had been: reckless, disrespectful, and out of control. The memory of the incident stayed with Karen throughout the day, following her like a shadow. And though she didn't show it, a part of her knew that she had learned a valuable lesson, one that would stay with her, even if she wasn't ready to face it just yet. The next day, as Karen walked around the city, the weight of her actions from the day before seemed to follow her. Everywhere she went, she couldn't help but recall the angry exchange with the royal guard, the disapproving looks from the crowd, and the embarrassing scene she had caused. Despite her best efforts to focus on the beautiful sights around her, her thoughts kept drifting back to that moment. Her friends were being unusually quiet, and it didn't take long for Karen to notice. They were clearly uncomfortable, and she could feel the distance growing between them. The normal chatter and jokes that would usually fill their day out exploring had stopped, replaced with awkward silences. Karen wanted to pretend like nothing had happened, but it was impossible to ignore the tension in the air. "Are you guys okay?" she asked, trying to sound casual as they walked down a busy street. She looked at each of them, but none of her friends made eye contact with her. They all looked down at their phones, distracted by anything other than her. One of her friends, Kelly, finally spoke up, but her voice was hesitant. "Look, Karen, we just don't know what happened yesterday. You were acting completely different. It wasn't like you at all." Karen's stomach twisted. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks. "What do you mean?" "I was just having a little fun," she said quickly, her words defensive. "No, Karen," Kelly said, her tone soft but firm. "It wasn't fun. It was reckless. You yelled at a royal guard. You almost touched the horse. It was disrespectful. We're just trying to say that maybe you should think about how you're acting. You don't always have to get your way." Karen was quiet for a moment. She didn't like hearing this, but deep down, she knew they were right. Still, she wasn't ready to admit it. "I wasn't doing anything wrong," she muttered, barely audible. "Karen, come on," another friend, Lily, added gently. "You know how we feel about you, right? We don't want to see you acting like this. We're all here to enjoy our time together, but we can't ignore what happened. You were acting so entitled, and you hurt the guards. They were just doing their jobs." Karen's breath hitched as she heard her friend's words. She was used to them being on her side, always agreeing with her, but now it felt like they were turning against her. She hadn't realized how much her behavior had affected them until now. "I wasn't trying to hurt anyone," Karen said, her voice small. I don't know, I was frustrated. And then I drank too much. But that's not a big deal, right? I wasn't trying to make a scene." Kelly sighed deeply, looking at Karen with concern. "It's not just about the drinking. It's about how you treated people. That guard didn't deserve that, and neither did the horse. You acted like you were above the rules, and people saw that." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. She could feel the truth starting to sink in, and it made her uncomfortable. All this time, she had been blaming others, convincing herself that it wasn't her fault. But now, as she heard her friends speak honestly about the situation, the realization hit her hard. She had been disrespectful, selfish even. And for what? A moment of misplaced fun. The silence between them stretched on. The usual rhythm of their vacation was gone. Even the vibrant city around them couldn't distract her from the awkwardness and guilt that had settled in her chest. She felt like an outsider in her own group. As the day went on, Karen tried her best to enjoy the sights, but her mind kept returning to what happened. Everywhere she looked, there were reminders. People laughing in groups, tourists taking pictures with the guards, and the looming memory of the incident. She found it harder and harder to act like everything was fine. Later that afternoon, they all sat down at a small cafe, but Karen could barely focus on the menu. The conversation had shifted to other things, but Karen was still lost in her own thoughts. She glanced around at the others, who were discussing places they'd like to visit next. The contrast between their carefree chatter and her own feelings of guilt was stark. As they finished their drinks, Kelly spoke again. This time, her voice was softer, almost as if she had been waiting for Karen to come to a realization on her own. "Karen," she said gently, "we just want you to be happy. We don't want you to keep making the same mistakes over and over. We know you didn't mean to cause all that trouble, but maybe you need to take a step back and think about how you're treating people. It's not just about you." Karen couldn't hold it in anymore. She placed her hand over her face, trying to hide the tears that had started to form. "I don't know what happened to me," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I don't know why I acted like that. I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking, and I hurt people. I never meant to. I didn't mean to make anyone upset." Her friends looked at each other, their expressions softening. They had been waiting for this moment, for Karen to take responsibility for her actions. Kelly reached over and put her hand on Karen's. "It's okay, Karen. We know you didn't mean it, but it's important to learn from this. We're all here for you." For the first time since the incident, Karen felt a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't going to be easy to move forward, but hearing her friend's understanding made her feel like she could start to make things right. She wasn't sure if she could undo the damage she had done, but maybe, just maybe, she could start by being more mindful of her actions going forward. As they left the cafe, Karen walked beside her friends, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't felt in days. The city still held its charm, And though the memory of yesterday was still fresh in her mind, she now had the chance to make things better. She knew it would take time, but she was ready to try. The next few days of the trip felt different. Karen tried her best to move on from the embarrassment of the previous day, but it wasn't easy. Every time she passed a royal guard or saw a horse in the distance, her stomach turned. She couldn't escape the memory of how she had acted, and the people who had witnessed it had made it even harder to forget. Her friends, though supportive, were still distant. They hadn't fully gotten over the incident, and Karen could sense that. They didn't speak about it directly, but the tension was there, like an invisible wall between them. Karen tried to make light of things, suggesting new activities or trying to bring some fun back to their trip, but it always felt a little forced. On the fourth day of their trip, they went to visit a museum. It was a beautiful building, filled with art and history. Karen had always enjoyed museums, but today she felt distracted. She couldn't focus on the exhibits. Instead, her mind kept drifting back to the royal guard and the horse. What had she been thinking? Why had she let her temper get the best of her? As they moved from one room to the next, Karen's guilt started to weigh even more heavily on her. Her friends were admiring the artwork, chatting about their favorite pieces, but Karen found it hard to get excited about anything. She had let herself down, and even though her friends had forgiven her, she couldn't forgive herself just yet. At one point, they all gathered in front of a large painting that captured a historical moment. An ancient battle, with soldiers on horseback, their swords raised in victory. It was powerful, and Karen tried to appreciate the beauty of the piece, but her thoughts kept going back to that moment with the guard. Kelly must have noticed that Karen wasn't her usual self because she approached her and whispered, "You okay?" Karen looked up, startled, and then gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "Yeah, just thinking." She looked back at the painting, but her mind was a million miles away. Kelly didn't press her. Instead, she just nodded, understanding that Karen needed some time. The two of them stood there for a few moments, quietly contemplating the painting. It felt like the first time since the incident that Karen had been able to just stand in the moment, not thinking about the past or what she had done wrong. Later, as they were leaving the museum, Karen found herself walking behind her friends. She could hear their laughter and their easy conversation, and for the first time, she felt a little bit of the old joy returning. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to move past the shame and guilt. That night, after dinner, Karen decided to take a walk by herself. She needed some space, some time to think and clear her head. The streets were quieter than usual, with only a few people strolling around the city. The lights from the shops and cafes cast a warm glow on the cobblestone streets, and the air was cool and crisp. Karen found herself near the area where the royal guard had been posted. It wasn't the same spot, but it was close enough to bring back the memories. She paused for a moment, standing at the edge of the square, taking in the surroundings. The events from a few days ago felt like they had happened in another lifetime. As she stood there, Karen thought about everything she had learned. She had made a huge mistake, but she also realized that mistakes were part of life. It wasn't about never making a mistake. It was about how you handled them afterward. She had apologized to her friends, but it wasn't enough. She needed to take responsibility for what she had done, and that started with learning from it. With that in mind, Karen decided she wasn't going to let this incident define her entire trip. She wasn't going to keep punishing herself for something that had already happened. It was time to move forward. She was ready to make the most of the rest of her time abroad and enjoy the beautiful moments that the trip still had to offer. The next day, Karen woke up early with a new sense of purpose. She wanted to make things right. After breakfast, she approached Kelly and Lily, who were sitting by the window, looking out at the city. "I've been thinking," Karen began, her voice steady but sincere, "about what happened the other day. And I just want to say, I'm really sorry. I've been acting like a child, and I shouldn't have treated anyone like that. You guys didn't deserve it." Kelly looked up at her with a soft smile. "Karen, It's okay. We know you didn't mean it. You've already apologized. I know, Karen said, nodding. But I want to make sure you know that I understand why it was wrong now. I wasn't respecting anyone, and that was unfair to the guards, and to you guys too. Lily smiled warmly and gave her a hug. We're glad you're realizing it. That's what matters. Karen smiled back, feeling lighter than she had in days. The heavy cloud of guilt that had been hanging over her seemed to finally lift. Her friends weren't holding it against her anymore, and she was beginning to see that making mistakes didn't mean she was a bad person. It just meant she was human. The rest of the trip went by much more smoothly. Karen took extra care to be respectful, both to the people around her and to herself. She made sure to enjoy each new experience and to appreciate the beauty of the city without letting her frustrations cloud her judgment. By the time they returned home, Karen felt like a different person. She had learned a lot from the situation, and she knew it would stay with her for a long time. More importantly, she understood that growth often came from the most difficult moments, and while she could never undo what had happened, she could choose to move forward, wiser and more thoughtful than before. After returning home, Karen couldn't shake the feeling of relief. The days following her trip had been calmer, and she felt a sense of peace that had been missing before. The weight of her actions no longer hung over her, though the lesson from the incident with the Royal Guard remained with her. She had changed, and she knew it. Her friends had been supportive when she returned, and although they hadn't forgotten the incident, they had let it go. In fact, they had all become closer during their trip, sharing more open conversations and offering each other more understanding. Karen could see that her behavior had been a turning point for all of them. At work, though, things were a little different. Her colleagues had noticed a shift in her demeanor. Karen was now more patient, more aware of the way she spoke to others, and most importantly, she had developed a deeper sense of empathy. It wasn't something she had consciously worked on, but the lessons from her trip had worked their way into her daily life. One afternoon, Karen was having a coffee break when her colleague, Mike, approached her. Mike had always been friendly, but never particularly close to her. He took a seat across from her, a thoughtful look on his face. You know, he began, I've been meaning to talk to you about something. Karen raised an eyebrow, wondering what he was about to say. Sure, what's up? I've noticed something different about you lately, Mike said, smiling. You seem, I don't know, more aware of how you come across. It's a good change. Karen felt a blush creep up her neck. She wasn't used to people noticing such things. Really, I guess I've just been trying to work on myself. Mike chuckled. Well, it's working. You've always been nice, but there's this new level of understanding. It's good to see. Karen wasn't sure how to respond. She hadn't expected her colleagues to notice her internal growth, but in a way, it felt validating. Maybe the lessons from her trip were affecting more than just her friends and herself. It was clear that her behavior was rubbing off on others in a positive way. As the days went by, Karen began to see more opportunities to apply the lessons she had learned. When a situation arose at work where a customer became upset over a small issue, Karen handled it with calmness and respect. She didn't snap back or let the frustration take over. Instead, she listened carefully, offered an apology, and found a solution. Later that evening, she thought about the difference in how she reacted compared to how she would have handled it before the trip. Back then, she might have been defensive or impatient, but now, with a sense of perspective, she found herself able to control her emotions better. It felt good to be able to handle things with a clear mind. At home, Karen spent more time reflecting on her journey. The trip had been eye-opening in ways she hadn't expected. She had gone to that city seeking an escape, a chance to relax and have fun, but what she found was a deep reflection of herself. The situation with the Royal Guard had forced her to confront parts of her personality that she wasn't proud of, but it also pushed her to grow. She had learned to be more aware of the impact of her actions on others, and she had gained a deeper understanding of respect, not just for people, but for traditions and places. One evening, As she sat with a cup of tea, Karen found herself thinking about the guard and the horse again. She wondered if the guard had ever had to deal with tourists who acted out of line. She imagined that this was a common occurrence for them. Despite her shame about how she had treated him, Karen now realized that the guard had handled the situation with calm dignity. He hadn't let her provoke him. He had remained respectful, and that was a lesson in itself. Karen knew she would never forget what had happened. It would always be a part of her journey, a pivotal moment that had changed her, but it didn't define her. What mattered now was how she moved forward. Weeks passed, and Karen continued to grow. She found herself getting involved in more community events, helping others whenever she could, and volunteering for causes that she believed in. Her friends noticed the changes, and they too felt inspired to be more thoughtful in their own lives. The lesson had rippled outward, touching everyone around her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Then, one evening, Karen received a message from Kelly. It was a simple message, but it made Karen's heart swell with gratitude. "Hey, just wanted to say I'm really proud of you. I can see how much you've changed, and it's inspiring." Karen smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. She quickly typed a response. "Thank you. I really appreciate you sticking by me." The message from Kelly felt like a full circle. It reminded Karen of how far she had come and how much she had learned from that single embarrassing incident. What had felt like a terrible mistake had ultimately been a powerful turning point in her life. It wasn't about the mistake itself, but how she had responded afterward. Looking back, Karen realized that sometimes the most difficult moments in life were the ones that shaped us the most. She had grown stronger, more understanding, and more respectful of herself and others. And in the end, that was the most important thing she could take from the experience. With each passing day, Karen knew that she was becoming the best version of herself. And though she would never forget that day with the Royal Guard, it was no longer something that defined her. It was something she had learned from, and she was better for it.